Here we go.
Thank you, Sharon. The story I'm going to talk about today, I'm calling it my story, not history, not her story, but my story. And it's about the Champlain Monument. So it's a very important, but a very small part of my life. And I learned from a very young age that events and history can have a huge personal impact on us, and they guide the trajectory of our life. It's up to us to decide what route we would like to take. History tells us that treaties of peace and friendships were formed of agreement between the First Nations and the nations of Holland, Britain, and France. In 1609, various First Nations started to form economic and military alliances with Samuel de Champlain. They agreed to exchange furs for French goods, and Champlain agreed to military alliances. Initially, I wanted to tell more of a story about Champlain and how the Champlain Monument came to be in Orillia. But as I reflected, I remembered my grade 8 history class where I learned about Canada's explorers. I learned little about Canadian Indigenous people because the focus was on the English and the French. The first Canadians were included in this history only as it related to the colonial nations. As a child, history was always something that really interested me, whether it was telling and listening stories about my family around the dinner table, or learning about those first explorers who came to Canada before we were even known as Canada. One of the explorers that I remember learning about in Beaverton Public School was Samuel de Champlain, a fur trader who had come to this very region hundreds of years earlier. But I remember Samuel de Champlain as a fur trader, portaging in rough waters, negotiating his way through and surviving through the very harsh terrain and winters of Canada. I do recall coming to Orillia in that history class to see the great Champlain Monument that sat at Coochie Beach Park. And I remember being disturbed by the grandeur and what seemed to me, even at that young age, as the towering priestly figures striking the prone Indigenous men. I didn't understand it then, but came to recognize the effects of the kneeling men who appeared to be cowering under the threat of the priests. Some will debate me on that, and that's good. Debate is good. But that's what I remember from the first time I saw that monument, and it still appears to me now in that way. The Champlain Monument is 12 feet tall, and Champlain is dressed for French court, something I don't recall ever being taught about in the Canadian history classes that I went to. It was commissioned to and created by Mr. Vernon March to mark the 300th anniversary of when Champlain originally arrived in this region in 1615. It was an effort to bridge some of the divide between French and English Canada at that time. But the work was delayed because of World War I, and it was unveiled 10 years later on July the 1st, 1925, in front of about 10,000 spectators, including of the dignitaries at the time. The ownership and the maintenance of the monument, together with the area of land 10 feet all around which upon it sat, was transferred to the Department of Northern Affairs and National Resources in 1955. Champlain wasn't a godsend to the Indigenous people, though they worked together in peace. Champlain was the benefactor of most of their interactions. In fact, his life was saved by the Indigenous inhabitants who had an intimate knowledge of the Canadian landscape, weather, and environment. Our recent conversations about the monument initially stressed how we can't erase history. I don't think that's what anybody was or is trying to do. We're trying to have a more accurate, complete history and portray the truths of that time. We're trying to acknowledge the huge contribution that was and is still being made by Indigenous Canada. There were partnerships that helped to build our nation, and they were on equal footing for a long time. The Indigenous people of that time had very efficient and elaborate governance systems of their own that were based on cooperation within their communities. Their system was not based on royalty, hierarchy, or economic wealth. That was brought to North America by the French and English explorers and settlers and held together by the colonial government. After more discussion in the community, I think people were finally convinced that the Champlain Monument was not an accurate portrayal of history. Another reason to bring it back as it was had to be found. The focus came to be on the protection of an artistic interpretation and landmark within our city. The jump from history to art was made quite effectively by some, but it completely ignored the feelings of shame, guilt, and anger that were and are still felt by so many, including me. If art is what it is, a community work of art should inspire, not divide. Why can we as human beings not understand attitudes that try to erase or minimize a painful past history that prevents us from moving forward in a healthier and a good way? Why can we not recognize that truth has to guide us forward? I can see that monument in my mind every time I go to Couchiching Beach Park, even though it isn't there for now. What comes to mind is the subjugation of people who trusted and tried to adapt to changes that were brought to this land and imposed on them, often violently and at their expense. Half a century later, it reminds me of abuse and assault, much as it did when I was probably only 12 years old. It may not be what the sculptor meant to portray, or even those who commissioned it, but to me, a white Canadian woman with Irish and Eastern European descent, who is a survivor of childhood trauma at the hands of a religious servant, that's what it portrays to me. And it remains a harsh reminder every time I go to the park. I can only imagine what it portrays to the people and families who were assaulted because of their culture and who they were. I hope the route we decide to take includes a more accurate portrayal of the history of this region that honors and respects the original inhabitants here and throughout Canada, and acknowledges the impacts of our shared history. Thank you for listening.